The left has this formula line they trot out. That's a real conversation stopper in political debate. It is making up for historic injustices. Fine phrase, pregnant with meaning. But it's an argument that needs to be really, looked at and analysed, and because it does have a sort of powerful resonance because of the supposedly obvious injustices that have been perpetrated by the patriarchy against women and white people against black people. It seems especially applicable in the case of women who have been the object of past injustices. Of course, I don't think women have been treated unjustly as leftist political activists portray it. It's more like they have suffered the injustices of life by having a subordinated position in the scheme of things with regard to men. Men have a sort of dominant role in the scheme of things because they just leave a bigger footprint in what happens in the world. I mean, men are physically bigger than women for a start. They have bigger brains, they have higher IQ, which is incidentally a verifiable fact, not just some kind of sexist statement. Analysis of SAT scores has shown that over the years, and that information is around and available, and people can look into this and see that it's actually quite a valid statement if they care to look at it with a dispassionate eye. And yes, they do leave a bigger footprint. It's just a fact of life. I won't go into this fully here and now, but the feminist dogma is that the subordinate place of women is something that women and men have been just kind of brainwashed and conned into believing. And they get away with it because our society that lacks the moral gravitas to stand up to what they're saying. So the idea of an injustice, consciously perpetrated injustice, just gets by without comment, largely. But this is a really powerful statement, because to a lot of people it's so obviously true that women have been treated unjustly, and they will cite the fact that women were denied an education, which is a bit of a fallacy in the sort of modern world. I mean, women have been educated in the modern world for centuries, and to observe that all the great artists and musicians and philosophers were men, historically, women just weren't educated back then, but when you're looking at the dominance of men in these fields in recent centuries, that doesn't stand up, because women have been receiving quite a good education in the Western world for a very long time. And apropos this whole subject, the injustice is not really an injustice at all. It's just a recognition that men had more potential to excel in these fields, and resources should be put towards educating boys and men, and the education of women should be de-emphasised because they lacked the aptitude to excel in a lot of these fields. And I, for one, if I was managing the education system of a third world country, managing to get by on limited funds, I would, without hesitation, preference boys in the education system, because I would know that for my dollar, for every dollar spent, I would get a much better return from boys than girls, because boys and men, males, have a drive to succeed that women don't have in so many fields of life that have a really, really big impact on life as we live it, and that to me would be anything but an injustice. It would be an injustice to do otherwise. But this statement deserves to be taken apart and analysed, because it certainly does play a big role in dictating how we think about the world. The social engineers can't benefit women or black people through affirmative action without discriminating against white men in the process, which is an injustice. And they meet that argument by saying, yes, but it makes up for the injustices of the past, the historic injustices that have put women into the situation they currently find themselves. Now, logically, the only way to make up for a historic injustice is to take the person against whom the injustice was perpetrated, fix up the problem, and then off we go. But this argument is put across in this kind of mega sense of, oh, women were subject to such injustices in the past. For example, they didn't have the vote, or they weren't able to stand for Parliament. So we will make up for that injustice by preferencing women in the political system, which is what the major parties all do. In Australia, Labor has a women's quota, which is a tacit recognition that women aren't equal to men. They need men's help to succeed, quote unquote. I'm not sure that a political career constitutes success for the average woman, for most women, but they believe so. And the logic goes something like this, that if we just get women into Parliament today, they will be there legislating and all the rest of it, making up for all the non-participation of women in previous parliaments and in the political system in the past. Now, this is really just all so much rhetoric and sloganeering. In Australia, the classic illustration would be Australia's first token woman Prime Minister, one Julia Gillard, who was given a winnable seat, that is to say a seat that her party could not lose, and that is how she got her entree into the Australian Parliament. Most Australians don't know this, probably don't care. The Australian Labor Party has a female quota for winnable seats. The Liberal Party, its main opposition, is smart enough not to have a quota, but obviously practices the same principles in advancing or in trying to advance women as much as possible and get as many female bums on seats in the Parliament as possible, just by different means, but it's the same basic philosophical stance. So Julia Gillard can truthfully say that she had to fight tooth and nail to win pre-selection for this winnable seat, because she did have an opponent. It was another woman who would have then gone on, I dare say, to have become Australia's first token Prime Minister in preference to her. But most people think that she had to fight tooth and nail against a whole bevy of men, and she just got there on her own devices and abilities and all the rest of it. So she got automatic entree into the Australian Parliament. Any male candidate was just unfairly discriminated against in his desire to put his hand up for that winnable seat. Men just, need not apply. So that injustice just gets by without comment. As soon as she got into Parliament, she was obviously fast-tracked for a place in Cabinet. Her chances of becoming Prime Minister go from something like 23 million to 1 when she gets into Parliament It drops down to about 200 to 1 in terms of the number of parliamentary representatives there are, and in cabinet comes down to something like 20 to 1. Now, I mean, I could have been pre-selected for that seat and been given the same path to power, but as a woman, she was just given that red carpet treatment. So, bingo, we have a correction for past injustices. Now, of course, logically, the only making up of past injustices would be to take a woman who, like 80 years ago or something like that, wanted to get into Parliament, and she was just told, no, you can't do that because you're a woman. Going back in time and fixing up that injustice, but you can't do that. So they resort to this kind of fiction called making up for past injustices vis-a-vis a modern woman in the current political situation. Now, we've already made a little bit of a skip in logic here. We haven't made up for a past injustice about a particular person, for one thing, and we're just left with this kind of waffly statement about the general kind of position of women in the scheme of things, and you're making up for all the past injustices through just a simple act. Doesn't matter how many acts you perpetrate in the modern world, the two things don't meet in the middle. Because just how you have fixed up a past injustice by pushing a woman into the Australian political system right up to the point of the Prime Ministership, exactly what kind of injustice have you actually corrected? Given that logically the injustice, quote unquote, of the past, telling women they couldn't enter politics, there were women in Australian politics decades ago who somehow managed to do that. So how has benefiting just one woman fixed up that vast historical injustice? Exactly how has that happened? Because if it was an injustice, the point is that for decades, for centuries, women have been educated quite well, and for decades, there's been nothing standing in the way of women entering politics, getting elected on their own merits. I'm not talking about affirmative action, just doing it for themselves. Of course, naturally, unlike the situation that prevails today, there would still be relatively few women in that category, the Margaret Thatcher types or the Golda Meir types, the real women achievers. Women have been free to carve out a political career if they want to, and all you've done is engaged in a posturing exercise, empty of meaning, except that you have vastly, unjustly discriminated against men in the process. Now, this is what characterises leftism, which fails to recognise the nature of reality. That all they're doing is engaging in window dressing, and the only real thing of substance which you have done has been to carry out this massive act of discrimination against men, and in fact that characterises the whole leftist project of advancing supposedly oppressed people, just engaging in their own particular brand of discrimination and injustice. Of course, feminism and ideas of men oppressing women is based on the idea that men sort of club together and conspire to bring down women. There's that literally, if they see some woman advancing in some field of human endeavour or in a profession or something like this, they literally get together and figure out some way of derailing her career. It's hard to believe that they can sort of run this line and expect anybody to believe it. But it's implicit in what they believe, that men are consciously and deliberately doing all this. That it's literally a male conspiracy. And another aspect of these historic injustices against women, I can demonstrate just what a fallacy this is. You've just got to look at the suffragette movement. Now, I've never studied the suffragettes or looked into it in any great depth or anything like that, but I can tell you now what the suffragettes were really on about. Everybody thinks that the suffragettes just wanted to win the vote for women, and once that had been achieved, they just packed up their things and went home, having being satisfied that they'd accomplished some great work. But that's only really a small part of it. I can tell you now what suffragettes really wanted. They fully expected that once women got the vote, that women would set about voting other women into power, and that within 10 or 20 or 30 years, half the parliamentarians would be women and exercising all this political power. And that never happened. And that belies the whole idea of these historic injustices when it comes to women being cut out of the political system. Because women didn't get together and just vote women into power. Whether it was because women didn't put up their hand for a political career, but it just did not happen. And none of this had anything to do with men consciously and deliberately working an injustice against women. Now, in the light of the foregoing, you may well suspect that I believe that men are superior to women. This is a sort of delicate issue because, I could live 5 lifetimes and not need to state that I think men are superior to women. And most self-effacing people don't go about, trumpeting this, oh, I'm superior to you. If I'm a man, I'm superior to a woman. The fact is, it's all about apples and oranges. We, men and women, have different roles to play. We have different strengths and weaknesses and all the rest of it. And there's absolutely no need to see apples as being superior to oranges unless somebody puts that across as a political proposition, which, of course, feminists do. They're the ones who put all of this stuff on a war footing of hatred and discord between men and women, as well as all the other segments of society that they fit into this Marxist class war concept. But these days, I don't have too much problem just stating that men are superior to women, because there's a lot of supporting evidence that in so many different ways that is true. But the main point is that if a man publicly declares that men are superior to women, he will be sort of sacked and punished and sent to Siberia and all the rest of it. But if a woman and feminist declares that women are superior to men, which they frequently do, they won't face any recriminations. They won't lose their job or be sort of abused or punished in any way. Indeed, they will be applauded, given a medal, probably nominated, as Australian of the Year, all for a statement which has absolutely no factual basis. That's all for now.